Let me tell you something most historians will not dare admit on record. Every society, yours, mine, even the most enlightened, has always needed a monster. Not a beast from the forest, not a phantom from the grave, but something more intimate, a monster with a human face. And in the Western world, for over 1,000 years, we gave that monster one name: the witch. I am not here to tell you fairy tales. You already know those. I am here to unmask them, to show you what lay behind the bonfires, behind the whispered accusations, behind the trembling prayers. I will tell you what people really saw, what they truly feared: disease, famine, rebellion, the very cracks in their fragile social order. They called it witchcraft. Science calls it something else. But we'll get there. For now, step closer. Tonight we open the mirror, and once you see what stares back, you cannot unsee it. This is the curse of the witch, from ancient priestess to Salem trials. I never meant to bring the mirror home. It was late October and cold enough that Boston glass breathed its own fog. The auctioneer called it colonial, a black frame-looking glass with silver turned somber by centuries. I told myself I wanted it because I'm a historian of the occult, and the artifact would trigger insight. The truth was meaner. I wanted to see what frightened other people. I paid too much, wrapped it in brown paper, and set it against the wall of my narrow apartment, where the streetlights turned the floorboards to drowning lanes of amber. It took 3 nights to speak. The first night, it only caught me slantwise, my reflection lagging a half-second behind, as if it were listening. The second, I dreamed of ash and a woman's fingers, chapped and clever, working fever-few into a paste. The third, the glass darkened around the edges like a bruise, and I realized what I'd brought home was not a mirror. It was a room. I say this as a person who loves footnotes. The fact is, certain objects hold their past the way a jar holds smoke, imperfectly, but enough. I've spent my life in archives where the air tastes like old ink and skin cells, and I'm telling you, some histories aren't read, they're inhaled. When the room opened in the mirror, it smelled of wet wool and tallow. I saw the slope of a roof beam and the corner of a hearth. There was a stool by the fire and a braided rug, as if someone had tried to domesticate the dirt. A girl crossed that space. 16, maybe. The kind of thin that comes from winters. She looked up at me. "Go," she mouthed. The word fogged the inside of my glass. I woke on the floor, cheek to the cold. In the real room, morning flared, clean, ordinary, almost obscene. I made coffee too strong and told myself I'd had a fugue, a trick of the brain. But the mug trembled against my lip because somewhere between my synapses and that dark rectangle was a girl who wanted me gone. You should know what I did next. I did what Americans do when confronted by the supernatural. I researched. Her dress, homespun, the waist too high, placed her around the last decade of the 17th century. Salem era. My professional life began in court transcripts from 1692, in the brittle language of suspicion. Specters, fits, pinpricks, poppets. But it's one thing to parse goody so-and-so on paper, and another to watch a child mouth a warning through your furniture. That night, the mirror room returned, brighter, as if the fire had been stoked. The girl wasn't alone. A second figure stood in profile, older. The kind of woman our records flatten into archetype. Midwife, widow, healer, words that age into witch when men get nervous. The older woman's hands moved over a tin plate laid with crushed seeds, a pinch of foxglove perhaps, or more likely pennyroyal, the kind of plant women carried like a secret. She glanced toward the girl and then, God help me, toward me, seeing through. "Stop," I whispered. To whom, I don't know. To history. To the glass. to the part of me that had dragged a burning century into my apartment. But the scene didn't listen. A door banged. A man shouldered in, snow in his beard and righteousness about him like armor. The girl flinched. The older woman didn't. He spoke, and though I couldn't hear the words, I knew the cadence. Accusation with the rhythm of scripture. The girl's mouth trembled around one word, please, and the mirror rolled black as if dunked in ink. I stared at myself, staring at myself. If you came here for a ghost story, you'll get it. But understand this. The monsters that survive in America don't survive because they're supernatural. They survive because they're useful. I spent the next day in the library, the mortal one, all fluorescent hum and penciled marginalia. The older woman's hands had told me enough. Herbcraft was knowledge, and knowledge gets criminal when power changes shape. In early New England, midwives and healers walked the knife edge between gratitude and dread. Pennyroyal for missed periods, foxglove for dropsy, nightshade for pain. A working woman's pharmacopoeia, exact, risky, miraculous, and lethal in clumsy hands. This is the part where the curtain lifts and the stagehands step into the light. When people in 1692 said witch, they often meant something else entirely, something we can name now. I have sat with neurologists who map fear onto the brain like old cartographers charting seas. They show me the temporal lobe, where seizures conjure voices and scent hallucinations, a sudden whiff of rot or smoke, and I think of girls in Salem heaving and shrieking in meeting houses. Temporal lobe epilepsy doesn't care for theology. It cares for electricity. It has a treatment plan and an ICD code. It was once an exorcism. I have stood in a lab while a mycologist, soft-spoken, hands dyed with spores, told me the story of ergot, claviceps purpurea, the fungus that colonizes rye and, in wet summers, blooms like soot. Its alkaloids, ergometrine, ergotamine, can clamp blood vessels tight, can convulse muscles, can make a mind levitate right out of its skull. Medieval Europe called it St. Anthony's fire for the way limbs burned from within. Imagine a village's bread tainted in a season of rain. Imagine waves of hallucination, pinpricks of light, insects crawling under the skin, the feeling of being ridden by something that isn't you. In a courtroom where the only experts are clergy, who would you indict? The fungus? Or the woman who knows which teas pause the womb? And then there's rabies, the loneliest of infections. Once it reaches the brain, it makes a person fear water, light, air. It drives biting, frothing, a bestial encroachment on the edges of self. In the 17th century, a mad dog gave you a curse with a prognosis of certain death. Today, we have post-exposure prophylaxis, vaccines, and immunoglobulin if we act before the virus crosses its private Rubicon. Modern medicine cannot resurrect the bitten dead, but it can keep the living from joining them. Our ancestors had no such mercy. A man foaming at the mouth looked like proof of something infernal and needed a witch to blame. Do you want contemporary proof that possession has a blood test? Consider anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, an autoimmune storm in which the body attacks its own brain. It is modern, documented, and diabolical in presentation. Paranoia, violent movement, catatonia, speech stripped to tatters. I have read the charts. Young women strapped to gurneys, eyes wild, speaking in clipped, uncanny syllables. 400 years ago, that's a demon. Today, an EEG spikes and an oncologist hunts an ovarian teratoma. Steroids, plasmapheresis, or rituximab drag the patient back from the labyrinth. Not every case is curable. Enough are to rewrite prophecy. Mass psychogenic illness, the polite term for contagious fear, can fell a town faster than any pox. We have footage from our age, schoolgirls fainting in sink, a factory's workers choking at a phantom odor, whole communities coughing at a rumor. In Salem, girls performed symptoms and caught them from one another as surely as we catch yawns. Perform is not to pretend. The body is a theater capable of believing its own script. The stage manager is stress. The orchestra is hunger. The audience is everyone. So, were there witches? Yes. If by witch you mean a woman who knew where the medicines grew and how not to make them kill you. Yes. If by witch you mean someone the New World Order needed to strip of authority. And yes, if by witch you mean the name you give a neighbor when your children twitch and the cattle die, and you cannot stomach a god who would allow such randomness. We conjure culprits when we can't cure causes. That night, the mirror found me again. The room's angles had sharpened, winter's kind of light. The older woman was gone. In her place, men, 3 of them, clustered and wrote. The girl sat on the stool, wrists knotted. She lifted her head and, with the terrible bravery of the doomed, she fixed her eyes on the glass. "Please," I said. But that wasn't what she wanted. "Watch," she mouthed. So I did. I watch what we do when we want meaning more than truth. I watch the men nod at one another, writing a story they could live with. I watch the girl become a sentence. You'll ask why I didn't smash the mirror, as if the past could be interrupted with a hammer, as if the sound of shattering wouldn't only leave me with 7 years of bad luck and an unedited century. Instead, I did the sacrilegious for my profession. I left the archive and went to a hospital. In the neurology wing, they keep the lights a little dimmer. Patients with fresh scars along their scalps, eyes diluted by anti-seizure meds. A resident scrolled through EEG tracings, epileptiform spikes that would have read in 1692 like the prongs of a devil's pitchfork. Another floor down, infectious disease nurses poured immunoglobulin, a clear river tricking a body out of its own betrayal. On my phone, I reopened the scans I'd saved of ergot sclerotia, those black commas in a stalk of rye. Scientists now can weigh their alkaloids in micrograms and cross-check symptom clusters against rainfall histories. Witchcraft dissolves into weather reports and supply chains. Tell me that isn't magic. As I left, a chaplain passed me in the corridor, an old man with kind hands. He nodded the way men nod in winter, when there's not much left to say. We live now with 2 liturgies, one written in molecules, one in mercy. The first gives us treatments, the second lets us sit with the unsolved. Back home, the mirror had cooled. It showed only my narrow life, books in stacks, the cup I always failed to rinse. I stood there until the streetlights cut out, and the city's gray replaced the night's black. Somewhere, the girl had learned her last line. You came to this channel for fear, and I've given you charts. You came for witches, and I gave you women with plants and men with pens. You wanted a curse. I showed you a fungus. But listen, I am not here to tidy dread into lesson. The truth is darker and, I think, kinder. The witch survives because she is the shape we give to the things that terrify us. Women who bleed without dying, heal without permission, decide without witness. The witch survives because disease throws shadows on the wall, and we paint faces on shadows to negotiate with them. The witch survives because grief is a country that needs a map, and a map needs monsters to warn us where the shoals are. The mirror? I still have it. You will ask if I've seen the room since. The answer is yes and no. The glass behaves now, but when I catch myself in it at 3:17 a.m., that haunted American hour when the radiators click like distant hooves, I see, just for a breath, the smudge of ash along my cheek. I see hands, hers, mine, dust-streaked and busy. I hear parchment whisper under a quill. I smell rye. And sometimes, when the winter is wet, I taste smoke on my tongue and remember. Our ancestors did not have the words we have. They had daughters. I did not bring a mirror home. I brought a door. Chapter 1 is only the foyer. If you'll step across it with me, I'll show you the house. The priestess who became a monster because a god changed jobs, the manual that taught men to hunt their midwives, the town that offered up its children to its own terror. We will unmask the witch not to make her disappear, but to make her human again, and to ask quietly, carefully, why we still need her. So welcome, wipe your feet. The floorboards are old and hold stories. Tonight, you're not alone. The mirror waited for me, patient as bone. I had draped a sheet over its black frame after the last visitation, as if cotton could smother centuries, but the glass glowed faintly from beneath, like an ember under ash. You don't extinguish history, you only delay its smoke. That night, when I lifted the sheet, the room had changed. No hearth, no timbered roof. Instead, pillars, stone, massive, breathing heat. The air swam with resin, frankincense burning in bronze bowls. Women moved there, tall, veiled, crowned with laurel or lotus, their arms painted in ochre spirals. They were singing in a tongue I had only seen in cuneiform tablets, syllables carved to honor Inanna, Ishtar, Artemis, the goddesses who governed blood and moon and childbirth. One of them turned toward me. Her eyes were not the frightened girls from Salem. They were steady, the kind of gaze that made kings flinch. In her hands, she held a copper bowl. Inside, something dark and thick glistened, wine, or blood, or the tincture of an herb boiled down to its essence. She raised it toward the altar fire and whispered words that slithered across the glass into my room. I felt my own scalp prickle. This was no witch. This was a priestess. History forgets slowly, then suddenly. Before the word witch existed, there were women like her, keepers of the calendar, interpreters of the sky, healers who pulled life from soil. They were mathematicians cloaked in incense smoke, midwives who could coax a breech birth into the world with hands and prayers. In Mesopotamia, they wrote prescriptions on clay tablets, juniper for chest pain, willow bark for fever, ergot seeds ground into tea to hasten childbirth. To us, these are the roots of pharmacology. To their neighbors, they were miracles and terrors both, because power wears two masks, the one that heals and the one that threatens. The mirror's vision shifted. I saw a woman kneeling by a laboring mother. Sweat ran down both their faces. From her satchel, the priestess withdrew a bundle of herbs, black, crooked seeds of claviceps purpurea, ergot fungus. She crushed them, mixed with honey, pressed them to the lips of the groaning woman. Minutes later, the mother convulsed, blood pooling. The child slid free, alive, screaming. The mother's eyes rolled back. Alive, barely. I shuddered. Ergot, a uterotonic contracting the womb, both savior and executioner. To the priestess, it was medicine. To the frightened family who saw spasms and blood, it was witchcraft. This duality, that knowledge can look like damnation, has never left us. Modern science decodes the tragedy. Ergot alkaloids, ergometrine, ergotamine, constrict smooth muscle. In low doses, they prevent hemorrhage after birth. In high doses, they convulse the uterus into rupture. We know this now. We balance it with sterile instruments, oxytocin drips, surgical theaters. But imagine Bronze Age huts where death and life wove together in straw. When the priestess saved a child, but the mother seized and foamed, how could the villagers explain it? Not chemistry, not vascular constriction, They saw a woman who bargained with forces beyond human, and the label followed: sorceress. The mirror darkened, then lit again. I saw a courtyard of stone under starlight. Another priestess traced the sky with a bronze pointer, murmuring the paths of Venus, the omens of eclipses. Astronomy, pure pattern recognition, read then as prophecy. When crops failed, when war came, her words bore the weight of accusation. She had seen too much. What moderns call ephemerides, ancients called spells. The line was thinner than breath. I pressed my palms to the glass. They were healers, I whispered to the dark. They were astronomers. They were midwives. But the vision shifted again, cruel. I saw a temple door thrown wide, soldiers storming in, banners of a new faith unfurled. The priestesses shrank, their veils torn, the chants cut short. What had been sacred yesterday became blasphemy today. The same women, the same hands, redefined overnight. It was not their gods who betrayed them. It was power itself. I returned to my desk, books spread like offerings. Hippocrates mentions ergot as early as 400 BCE. Roman midwives used pennyroyal to end pregnancies, an herb still toxic today, capable of killing liver cells as efficiently as it disrupts implantation. Ancient Egyptian papyri describe mixtures of honey and acacia, the latter rich in spermicidal compounds. Over and over, these women wielded knowledge of the body. They were pharmacists without white coats, obstetricians without licenses, and for that, they became witches. Even now, we can track their ghost in language. Pharmakon, Greek for drug, but also poison, also magic. In one word, you hear the entire curse. I leaned back. The room was cold. The mirror reflected only me, hollow-eyed, papers trembling in the draft. Do you understand? The witch did not appear in the forest, cackling. She was built from the rubble of the priestess, the midwife, the healer. When empires shifted gods, when patriarchy grew teeth, they needed a monster to justify the fire, and so they took the women who healed us, who mapped our stars, who steadied our infants, and they painted them with night. The curse was never theirs, it was ours. The mirror no longer showed firelight or temples. It showed a sky collapsing. At first I thought it was a storm, black clouds rolling, banners shredded by invisible winds. But then I saw what was really crumbling: statues, sanctuaries, the marble faces of goddesses tumbling into dust. Where once incense curled toward Inanna, Artemis, Hecate, there were now wooden crosses rising like iron nails. I pressed closer. My own breath fogged the glass. There were women standing among the rubble, women I recognized. Priestesses, midwives, healers. The same eyes that had once carried the weight of celestial calendars now darted like hunted animals. They clutched their herb pouches, their copper bowls, their words. But the air itself had shifted allegiance. A voice cut through, deep, male, triumphant, Latin, harsh, brittle. I caught phrases: heresy, idolatry, satanas. To these new priests, all gods not theirs were demons, and all hands that still remembered the old ways were unclean. The women were not accused of ignorance. They were accused of knowing too much. History makes the transition sound polite. Rome becomes Christian. Temples are converted into churches. Shrines are repurposed. But the mirror showed me the truth. The transition was not quiet. It was conquest. The goddess shrines, where women presided, were dismantled brick by brick, their sacred groves hacked down, their rites outlawed. Knowledge that had been divine on Monday became devilish on Tuesday. A midwife who mixed pennyroyal to ease childbirth was suddenly tempting women into sin. An astronomer charting eclipses became a conjurer of omens. A healer treating fever with willow bark was no longer wise. She was in league with darkness. The gods had changed thrones, and the women who once served them were chained to stakes. The mirror shifted again, a single face lit by torchlight, a bishop, his eyes sharp with certainty. Behind him, a crowd muttered prayers and curses. In his hand, he held a book, not a herbal, not an astrological chart, but a scripture. He read aloud, voice booming, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." It echoed not only in the glass but in my skull. Here it was, the pivot, the verse that would become a blade. Exodus 22:18, short, merciless, unforgettable. In one line, thousands of years of female power, ritual, and science became prosecutable crimes. The priestess had been renamed witch. I stepped back from the mirror, hands shaking. It's one thing to read a verse on paper, centuries away. It's another to hear it hurled like a sentence in the mouth of a man who believed it. But even scholarship cannot unhear. We know the pattern now. Anthropologists trace it. The gradual Christianization of Europe, the stamping out of pagan rites. Women's authority narrowed to the home, stripped from temple, field, and stars. When communities needed healers, they came in secret. When children seized with fever or mothers bled in childbirth, they still sought those same hands. But if outcomes soured, if fever turned to death, the same healer was the culprit. Witchcraft became the convenient word. Modern parallels sting. A woman's control over reproduction, then and now, has always been policed. Pennyroyal tea in the 10th century, abortion pills in the 21st. Knowledge of fertility shifts from empowerment to accusation, depending on who holds power. Then it was bishops. Now it is courts. The language changes, but the suspicion remains. Women who hold the keys to life and death must not be trusted. Even today, midwives in parts of the world face persecution, their skills dismissed as folk superstition, while sterile hospitals are far away. Yet scientific studies affirm their training, their survival rates. What the church once called demonic modern medicine now accredits. The line was never about efficacy, it was about authority. The mirror showed me one last scene before the night gave out. A circle of women, huddled in a ruined grove, whispering prayers not to gods, but to memory itself. They had been stripped of temples, robbed of legitimacy, hunted under law. And still, they passed the herbs hand to hand. Still, they remembered the skies. They did not vanish. They were buried, alive, under the word witch. And the earth has a way of remembering what it buries. I sat in my apartment as dawn burned the window pale. Somewhere outside, sirens moaned. The city woke. My mirror showed only my reflection now, exhausted, haunted. But behind my eyes, the chant remained. The moment when gods changed thrones, when the priestess became the witch, when sacred knowledge became heresy. And I understood. The curse was not cast by spirits or shadows. It was legislated, canonized, preached. The curse was bureaucracy in robes. And the cost of that curse would be measured not in myth, but in blood. The mirror did not wait for night this time. I walked past it in the afternoon, carrying groceries, and the glass was already dark as if clouds had pooled inside. I set the bag down and stood still, the hum of the refrigerator behind me, the hush of centuries before me. When the vision cleared, I was outside. The grove. It was twilight, always twilight in these visions, as if history can only be remembered at the edges of day. Oak trunks rose around me like pillars, their crowns knitted into a canopy. Torches sputtered, casting long shadows that twisted like dancers. And they were dancing, Women and men together, masked, painted, bodies smeared with ash and ochre, stomping the ground in a rhythm older than scripture. I realized what I was watching, a fertility rite, the kind later chroniclers would call sabbats. But here, in the moment, it was neither grotesque nor obscene. It was hunger turned into song. It was winter's fear answered by summer's promise. Still, to the eyes of the new church, it was unforgivable. The dancers circled a fire. In its glow, I saw bowls of grain, loaves of bread blackened at the edges, and something darker, what looked like a goat's heart skewered on a spit. One of the women lifted it high, red juices dripping onto the earth. The crowd cheered. Ritual sacrifice, I thought. But then memory whispered, or nourishment. Protein, shared. Symbol, made edible. How easy it is to mistranslate devotion. The priestesses had always presided over cycles, planting, harvest, birth, festivals that celebrated the earth's pulse. But, with gods dethroned, the same rites looked to bishops like heresy. The torchlit feasts became orgies. The animal sacrifices became demonic bloodletting. The healing chants became incantations. It was the same event, different narrator. I closed my eyes, but the sounds persisted. Drums, laughter, a scream, half joy, half grief. And then the mirror shifted, cruel in its juxtapositions. The grove dissolved into parchment, ink. A cleric's hand scratching words into the margins of a codex. He was not describing the dance as I saw it. He was rewriting it. His account spoke of women coupling with beasts, of ointments made from the fat of unbaptized infants, of wild flights through the night sky. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't history, it was propaganda, and yet, it worked. Modern scholarship confirms what the mirror showed me. Those lurid accounts, the witches' sabbats, were largely inventions, cobbled from rumor, confession under torture, and the paranoia of clerics desperate to explain why bad harvests came or plagues spread. Consider ergot once more, the fungus that rotted rye. Outbreaks often coincided with so-called witch panics. Villagers convulsed, hallucinated, screamed in unison. To church courts, these were signs of mass possession, the devil's Sabbath. To modern mycologists, they are vascular spasms, alkaloid intoxication, or take ritual feasting. In cultures from Gaul to the Norse, communal meals sealed bonds. Yet when archaeologists unearthed charred animal bones at ritual sites, clerical historians insisted they prove cannibalism. The truth? Barbecue pits, misread through theological dread. Even ointments, so often described as flying salves, were herbal balms. Nightshade, henbane, mandrake, tropane. Alkaloids absorbed through the skin. They induced hallucinations of flight, visions of leaving the body. The women who brewed them did not ride broomsticks. They experienced altered states. Pharmacology, not packs. But tell that to a terrified village, and you rob them of their scapegoat. So the lie spread easier than the truth. The mirror flickered one last image before fading. A child peering through the brush, watching the dancers. Her eyes were wide, not with horror, but with awe. She would grow up and remember it differently, perhaps whisper of joy, perhaps whisper of shame. Memory itself was the battlefield. I stepped back, heart pounding. My apartment was quiet, only the groceries still sweating on the counter. But inside me, the drums echoed. The forbidden rites were never forbidden by the earth. They were forbidden by men who feared the earth's power in women's hands. And that fear was about to birth its most lethal child, the great machinery of the witch hunt. The drums of the grove lingered in my skull long after the mirror went still. At night, when the city outside my window dissolved into sirens and fog, I would swear I still heard them. The beat of feet against earth, the hiss of sap crackling in flame. But the mirror no longer showed me dancers. It showed me their afterimage, how the world remembered them. And memory, I learned, is often more dangerous than truth. The glass rippled, like breath caught between teeth. I leaned closer. This time, there were no women, only stories about them. I saw a tavern in a medieval village, smoke thick as wool. A farmer hunched at the bench, muttering of a neighbor who had cursed his cattle. A shepherd swore he saw lights in the forest, women's laughter in the wind. The rumors hopped from mouth to mouth like fleas, each bite drawing a little more blood. Then I saw a monk at his desk, copying those whispers into a manuscript. He did not write of women gathering herbs or singing for harvest. He wrote of midnight rides, of orgiastic rites, of devil's embraces. The page drank ink greedily, turning gossip into gospel. And when he finished, he did not write, perhaps. He wrote, truth. The mirror shifted again. Now I stood at the threshold of a cottage. A woman bent over her child, pressing a poultice to a fevered brow. Outside, neighbors crowded, whispering. When the child shuddered in fever dreams, murmuring nonsense, the whispers thickened into certainty. She summoned spirits. She consorted with the devil. They did not see fever. They saw sorcery. They did not see illness. They saw evil. And so, a healer's touch became a witch's hand. Our age still has the receipts. Trial records from the 14th and 15th centuries preserve accusations so grotesque they sound theatrical. Witches, they claimed, could blight crops with a glance. They could steal men's virility with a curse. They could ride through the sky on broomsticks, an image likely born from folk rituals where poles smeared with hallucinogenic salves were straddled to induce visions. Today, pharmacology identifies those plants: henbane, belladonna, mandrake. They contain atropine, hyoscyamine, scopolamine. Ingested or absorbed, they cause vertigo, dissociation, sensations of weightlessness. Flight. The human mind, trying to explain the unexplainable, invented a broom. As for curses on cattle or children, these were outbreaks. Anthrax killing herds, dysentery striking infants, diseases nameless then, diagnosable now. Germs don't need sorcery to kill, they only need ignorance, but ignorance always prefers a scapegoat. The mirror's cruelest vision came last. A courtroom, stone walls sweating damp, torches sputtering. A woman stood shackled, lips cracked, eyes hollow. Before her, a judge proclaimed charges: that she had flown by night, that she had lain with demons, that she had brewed poisons in the shape of soups. The woman said nothing, because nothing she could say would matter. The narrative had already been written for her, inked in centuries of rumor and scripture. She was not being tried as herself. She was being tried as the shadow of 1,000 stories. I pressed my palms to the glass. Her eyes flicked up. For an instant, I thought she saw me. If she did, she must have known I could not save her. The torches flared, and the vision burned out. I sat alone, the hum of my refrigerator absurd in the silence. The lesson tasted metallic in my mouth. It was not the rituals that damned them. It was the stories. The priestesses of old had lost their temples. The midwives had lost their authority. And now, in taverns and pulpits, they were losing their humanity. Each tale sharpened the knife. Each rumor stacked the woodpile. The forbidden rites had been rewritten as nightmares. And nightmares, when believed, become law. The mirror did not show me dancers this time. It showed machines, not with gears and iron, but with parchment and fire. I saw a book, bound in leather, the color of dried blood, its title stamped deep into the hide. Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It lay open on a lectern while robed men bent over it, whispering. Their fingers, pale and ink-stained, traced each line like scripture. Outside the chamber, the world was still dark forests, hungry mouths, sick beds. Inside, they had decided what all of it meant. Witches. Always witches. I leaned so close to the glass that my breath clouded it. The scene shifted. A woman dragged into a hall, her wrists bound with rope that burned her skin raw. Around her, a crowd gathered of neighbors, clergy, magistrates. In the judge's hands was the hammer. He read aloud, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable." The crowd murmured assent. Her fate had already been written by men who had never met her. The hammer was not evidence. It was permission. Scholars now know what I was watching. Published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, the Malleus Maleficarum was not a neutral manual. It was a weapon. It catalogued every supposed sign of witchcraft, urged every parish and judge to hunt relentlessly, and, most damning of all, it codified misogyny into law. Kramer insisted that women were weaker in faith and more carnal than men, and therefore more vulnerable to the devil. His words did what swords could not. They spread suspicion like a plague, sanctioned by the imprimatur of the Church. And then came the trials. Tens of thousands across Europe, accusations, interrogations, executions. The mirror did not flinch. It showed me a chamber below ground, torches dripping wax like veins of fat. A woman stretched on a rack. Her screams fractured the air until they sounded less than human. A priest stood by, chanting prayers, convinced the agony was purification. Torture, in their logic, was not cruelty. It was truth extraction. Under pain, confession spilled. Sabbats, pacts, demons. Each word the interrogators already expected. Each word another brick in the edifice of certainty. I whispered into the glass, "Stop. She'll say anything. Don't you see?" But the men did not hear me. They only heard the devil speaking through her, confirming the story they'd written before she ever opened her mouth. Today, forensic psychologists would call it coerced compliant confession. Under extreme duress, the mind chooses survival. Say what they want and perhaps the pain will stop. We have documented cases, not just in the Middle Ages but in modern police interrogations, where innocent people confess to crimes they never committed. The pattern is ancient, but in the 15th century, there was no awareness of trauma psychology. A tortured admission was proof, and proof fed the pyres. The mirror grew hotter, as though the glass itself was a furnace door. I saw the stakes, women bound to them, wood piled high, flames climbing like eager beasts. The crowd chanted prayers and curses, unable or unwilling to see that what they burned was not evil but fear itself, given a body. The hammer of witches had done its work. It had turned neighbors into informants, courts into slaughterhouses, theology into bureaucracy. The mirror's light flickered, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw myself among the crowd, silent, complicit, watching the flames lick upward. And I understood the cruelest truth. History does not need us to believe its lies. It only needs us not to resist them. When the vision faded, I sat shivering though the apartment was warm. The Malleus was not myth. It was real. It can still be found in libraries, bound in crumbling leather, its Latin lines waiting like traps. I have turned those pages myself. They smell of dust and iron, and if you read too long, you almost begin to hear the fire crackle. The witches did not write their own story. Their story was written for them, by men with books and ropes and a hunger for certainty. And once the hammer fell, it would not stop until it crossed an ocean. The mirror woke me with the smell of smoke, not the faint tang of a candle guttering, but the thick, greasy stench of pyres. It filled my throat before my eyes even opened. When I staggered toward the glass, I saw a field, not a battlefield, not exactly, but a place where war was waged all the same. Stakes stabbed the sky like a forest of dead trees, and lashed to them were women, dozens, their skirts whipped by wind, their hair wild in the torchlight. The crowd pressed in close, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Priests held crosses aloft. A bell tolled, not to summon God but to drown out the screams. The fire caught, and the night itself seemed to flinch. The scene shifted, rapid and cruel. One town, then another. Germany, Lorraine, Scotland, France. Whole villages emptied of women in a season. The mirror did not pause on the executions alone. It showed me the process, accusations whispered in taverns, testimony wrung under torture, neighbors naming neighbors to save themselves. I saw a woman in Würzburg, her fingernails torn away until she confessed to flying on a pitchfork. Another in Bamberg, forced to admit she had kissed the devil's backside. In Scotland, a healer accused of using charms to ease childbirth. Under the thumbscrews, she agreed she had stolen babies' souls. The details varied. The pattern did not. Modern historians call these witch panics, and panic is the right word. Between 1560 and 1630, some regions of Europe executed more alleged witches than all the centuries before combined. Germany alone saw waves of trials where entire families, sometimes entire streets, were condemned. The numbers are staggering. Tens of thousands, some estimates higher. Each case fueled the next until the idea of witches became more real than flesh. Why? The mirror whispered answers in firelight. War, plague, famine. The 30 Years' War tore Central Europe apart, leaving famine in its wake. The Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons, withering crops. The Black Death still haunted memory. People demanded explanations, and explanations require culprits. Who better than the midwife whose herbs failed, the widow who muttered to herself, the poor woman whose misfortune already made the village uneasy? The glass flashed again. A courtroom in Toulouse. The accused, an old woman, skin taut over bones. The charge, that she had brought hailstorms. Today, meteorology explains hail with supercooled water droplets, ice nuclei, updrafts. But in that stone chamber, the explanation was simpler. She had cursed the sky, and the sentence was fire. The cruelest twist, the mirror showed me, was how execution became spectacle. I saw pamphlets hawked in marketplaces, woodcuts depicting horned women cavorting with demons, their breasts suckling imps. They were sold cheaply, read greedily, passed hand to hand. Terror became entertainment. Misogyny became merchandise. The pamphlets told people what to see, and soon they saw it everywhere. I pressed my forehead to the glass, nauseous. Scholarship today reads these woodcuts and trial records like case studies in hysteria, propaganda, and state violence. Psychologists dissect mass delusion. Sociologists note the weaponization of rumor, and feminists name it for what it was: gender genocide. But none of that dulled the image before me. A child holding her mother's hand as they both watched a neighbor burn. That child would grow up believing witches were real, and perhaps one day he would accuse someone himself. The fire roared brighter in the mirror until the flames licked the frame itself. I thought my apartment would ignite. I stepped back, trembling, the sound of bells still tolling in my ears. Europe was burning, not only bodies, but memory, Truth. Trust. The hammer had fallen, and it rang across a continent, and though oceans stretched wide and cold, the echo would carry. The new world was listening. The mirror shimmered with waves. For a moment, I thought it was showing me storms, gray Atlantic swells, ships pitching like toys. Then I realized it was not the sea itself. It was the cargo, not spices, not gold, ideas. The fire from Europe had crossed the water, stowed in the heads and sermons of the men and women who fled persecution. They came seeking purity, a city upon a hill, but they carried with them the very books that had lit the pyres, the Malleus, the catechisms, the whispered certainty that witches were real, that the devil walked among them. And they brought it here, to New England. The glass cleared and I saw a shoreline, stark, winter-bitten. The air itself looked stern, a cluster of timber houses crouched together against the cold. Men in black coats read scripture aloud. Women in white coifs lowered their eyes. Children recited verses with voices brittle as ice. Puritans. They had left behind bishops and kings, but not fear. They had stripped away cathedrals and saints, but not suspicion. They believed themselves chosen, a covenant people, and when you believe you are chosen, you also believe you are hunted. So every illness, every failed harvest, every stillbirth or dead cow, it had to have a cause, and cause wore a face. The mirror flickered. I saw a woman, tall, confident, standing before a group. Anne Hutchinson. She spoke of grace, of listening to God without clerical intercession. I watched the men's faces harden. A woman with a voice was already dangerous. A woman with theology was unbearable. Her punishment was banishment, not fire. But the word witch clung to her shadow as she disappeared into exile. Even here, the machinery was warming. The scene shifted again. A village called Springfield, 1645. Two women accused, Mary Parsons and her neighbor, each blamed the other for sickness and misfortune. The trial was crude, but the pattern familiar: suspicion, testimony, scripture, and fear. Later, in Hartford, a child's death sparked a panic. Several women hanged. One of them, also Young, became the first recorded execution for witchcraft in the American colonies. Her name is barely remembered. But her rope was the first knot tied on American soil. Historians now note how fragile those communities were, isolated, ringed by wilderness, threatened by harsh winters, famine, disease, and conflict with native peoples whose lands they had seized. Anxiety breeds monsters, and monsters need hunters. But unlike Europe, where inquisitors traveled town to town, in New England the courts were local. Ordinary farmers and preachers became witch-finders. Fear didn't trickle down from Rome. It bubbled up from kitchens, barns, and prayer meetings. The devil was no longer a distant theological threat. He was the neighbor in the next pew. The mirror grew restless, as though preparing me for what came next. I saw fragments. Girls shrieking in meeting houses, claiming invisible hands pinched them. Villagers whispering of spectral evidence, spirits tormenting in dreams. The gallows hill, rising against a pale sky. And then, a name written across the fogged glass: Salem. The letters glowed as though branded, hot and permanent. I tore the sheet back over the mirror, heart hammering. But I already knew there would be no escape. The echo of Europe's fires had arrived. It had taken root in Puritan soil, and soon it would flower into the most infamous harvest of all. The fever had crossed the sea, the stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise. The mirror was waiting for me when I came home. I hadn't touched it in days, but its surface pulsed faintly, as if it were a lung holding its breath. I knew what it wanted to show me. I knew the name that had burned itself into its glass. Salem. The vision began in a small, timber-walled house. The fire in the hearth glowed low. I saw a group of girls huddled together, their voices rising in a strange chorus, half prayer, half laughter, edged with hysteria. One of them convulsed, back arched like a bow. Another screamed that an invisible hand had scratched her. Their bodies spoke a language no one understood, and so the community wrote its own translation, witchcraft. Within days, the whispers spread. The mirror showed me Reverend Samuel Paris, face taut with fear and authority, listening as his own niece and daughter accused local women of tormenting them. The names came easily. Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados. Sarah Good, a beggar. Sarah Osborne, old and bedridden. The pattern was cruelly familiar, outsiders first. Those with no power, no protection. The devil always prefers the vulnerable, the villagers said. Convenient that the law agreed. I pressed my hand to the glass as the scene shifted to the meeting house. I could almost smell the sweat of the crowd, the wood sap bleeding from the beams. The accused women stood shackled. The girls shrieked, fell to the floor, claimed they were being bitten, choked, stabbed with invisible knives. Spectral evidence, the magistrates called it, visions, dreams, feelings. Proof visible only to the accuser. To us today, it sounds absurd, but in that winter of 1692, it was law. Modern medicine whispers a different story. Psychologists describe conversion disorder, where stress and repression manifest as uncontrollable seizures, paralysis, fits. Neurologists point again to temporal lobe epilepsy, or to ergot poisoning in rye bread, the same fungus that convulsed Europe. Social historians call it mass psychogenic illness, fear contagious as fever. But in Salem, none of those diagnoses existed. There was only scripture. There was only Satan. And once the first accusations flew, no one was safe. The mirror shifted rapidly, like a fever dream. Faces flickered. Bridget Bishop, her red cloak bright as a wound. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, frail, still accused. Giles Corey, crushed beneath stones, gasping. More weight. Each one swallowed by the machinery of fear. I tried to look away, but the mirror would not release me. What horrified me most was not the shrieks or the gallows. It was the silence of the crowd. Their eyes wide, their mouths shut. Neighbors watching neighbors hang, convinced that justice was being done, that God Himself demanded it. Silence, I realized, is the most faithful servant of hysteria. When the vision finally guttered out, I was shaking. I stared at my own reflection and saw the echo of their faces behind mine. Accused, accusers, all tangled together. Salem was not an anomaly. It was the American chapter in a much older book, written in Europe, printed on fear, bound in fire. The sickness was not the devil. The sickness was us, and the fever had only just begun. One blink I was in my apartment. The next I was inside a meeting house. The air was swollen with bodies, sweat, and candle smoke. At the center stood the court of Oyer and Terminer, the court assembled to decide who among them was human and who had already sold their soul. They did not look like villains. They looked like neighbors. I saw Judge Samuel Sewell's quill scratching names into the ledger. I saw John Hathorne lean forward, voice sharpened like a blade demanding confessions. And behind them, Reverend Cotton Mather, his eyes alight, not with cruelty, but with certainty. Certainty can be more lethal than malice. The accused shuffled in one by one. Women, mostly. Some young, some wrinkled as parchment. They were mothers, grandmothers, widows, beggars. Each stood trembling, each forced to face the shrieking children who claimed their souls had been clawed in the night. And then came the evidence. Not blood, not knives, not corpses, dreams, visions, the convulsions of children in the gallery, spectral evidence. The devil, they said, could take your shape and torture others in spirit. If a girl cried out that she saw you stabbing her, then you were guilty, even if your body never moved. Try disproving a dream. The mirror flickered through testimonies. Bridget Bishop denied everything. She was hanged. Rebecca Nurse prayed aloud. She was hanged. Martha Corey refused to confess. She was chained. Giles Corey, her husband, refused to plead at all, knowing a plea would damn either way. For that, he was laid in the dirt, stones stacked on his chest until his ribs splintered. His last words, "More weight." I pressed my palms against the glass, horrified. The stones seemed to press into my own ribs. Modern psychologists would call this a closed feedback loop. Fear produces accusation. Accusation produces trial. Trial produces execution. Execution produces more fear. And each time the machine turns, it becomes harder to stop. Confessions, extracted under threat of death, only fueled the fire. Those who admitted to witchcraft were spared the noose but forced to accuse others, and so the circle widened. It was contagion, not of disease, but of belief. Scholars today compare it to viral spread, the R0 of hysteria. Each confession infected a neighbor. Each death reinforced the delusion. The mirror showed me a girl standing in the court, clutching her stomach, shrieking that invisible claws tore her flesh. She collapsed, writhing, eyes rolled back. The crowd gasped. The magistrates nodded grimly. To them, it was proof. To us, it is diagnosis. Epileptic seizure, psychogenic fit, trauma embodied. But in 1692, medicine was prayer, and prayer was law. I saw the gallows rise, week after week, bodies swinging. By autumn, 19 people had been hanged, one pressed to death. Dozens more languished in fetid jails, shackled in cold filth. Even dogs were executed, accused of carrying the devil's imprint. The mirror lingered on the faces of the crowd, children staring wide-eyed, husbands refusing to meet their wives' eyes, ministers insisting God was purging his chosen colony. What I saw was not evil in the accused. It was evil in the silence. When the vision broke, I fell to my knees in my own room, gasping. My chest ached as if the stones of Giles Corey still pressed me down. I realized something cruel. Salem's hysteria was not a rupture. It was the climax of everything before: Europe's pyres, the hammer of witches, the whispers in taverns and pulpits. Salem was the perfect storm: Puritan piety, social fracture, fear of wilderness, fear of women, fear of themselves, and for a year they fed that storm with rope and fire. But every storm burns itself out, and the mirror was already stirring with the first cracks in Salem's certainty. Not wind in rafters, not the groan of ships at harbor, ropes straining under weight. I knew before I saw it. Gallows Hill. The glass showed me a slope of parched grass outside Salem village. At its crown stood the scaffold, rough timbers hammered into justice. Beneath it, a cart waited. Above it, the rope swung. The condemned shuffled forward, guarded by men who would not meet their eyes. Women clutched at hems, some wept, some prayed, some walked steady, with the calm of the already damned. Bridget Bishop was among them. Her red cloak blazed against the gray sky like defiance. They tied the noose. The crowd murmured. The trap was sprung. The body dropped. The mirror did not look away. Neither could I. One by one, the names followed. Rebecca Nurse, 71, nearly deaf, whispering a prayer as they bound her. Susanna Martin protesting her innocence to the end. Martha Carrier, accused of being the queen of hell. John Proctor, a farmer whose only crime was to defend reason in a season of madness. Each one swung, each one watched by their neighbors. The crowd's silence was worse than the gallows creak. Then the mirror showed me the death of Giles Corey, not at the gallows, but on the ground. He refused to enter a plea, knowing any word would bind his land to the court. So they pressed him, laid him flat, piled stones on his chest until his ribs cracked. I could hear the breath rasping from his throat, short and sharp, each one cut in half. The sheriff leaned close, demanding confession. Giles only croaked 2 words, "More weight." The mirror froze there, his eyes bulging, lips blue, defiance outlasting the breath in his lungs. And I understood. Sometimes resistance is not survival. Sometimes resistance is legacy. Modern historians tally the numbers: 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, dozens jailed, some dying in their cells. Even dogs executed, their bodies swinging as proof of the devil's reach. Psychologists explain the girl's fits as hysteria, conversion disorder, or ergot poisoning. Sociologists see scapegoating in a fractured community, anxieties about land, inheritance, gender, war. All of it true, all of it clinical, but none of it silences the sound of rope in the mirror. The trial records preserve words as cold as ink. Spectral evidence admitted. Guilty. Execution carried out. The bureaucracy of terror. But the mirror let me see what the records cannot. The faces in the crowd, husbands who turned away, children who bit their lips until they bled, ministers who prayed louder to drown out the gasp when the trapdoor fell. The horror was not just on the scaffold, it was in the silence of everyone who watched. When the glass finally cleared, I was weeping into my own hands. My apartment was quiet, but my ears rang with the echoes of the hill. Salem had reached its peak. The hysteria had claimed its blood. But hysteria is a fire, and fire consumes until nothing is left to burn. The first sparks of doubt had already begun to smolder in the ashes. Ministers uneasy with the reliance on spectral evidence. Judges wincing at the weight of too many corpses. Even Cotton Mather, once so sure, shifting in his certainty. The mirror seemed to pulse with that doubt, as if warning me. The storm was beginning to collapse under its own thunder. But collapse does not mean healing. Collapse means reckoning, and reckoning was next. I thought perhaps the story had ended with the gallows. That history, satisfied, had closed its mouth. But on the 4th night, the glass shivered like ice splitting on a pond, and I was pulled back. This time, there was no shrieking, no rope swaying in the sky. There was silence. And silence, at last, was dangerous. The vision showed me a chamber, the very same meeting house where verdicts had been thundered with such conviction. But now, the men within whispered instead of shouted. Their faces were pale, drawn, uncertain. Judge Samuel Sewell shifted in his chair, his hands trembling as he held the latest petitions. Ministers wrote letters urging caution. Too many neighbors had been executed. Too many confessions sounded like echoes of one another, as if rehearsed. Even the most devout began to ask, can the devil truly take the shape of an innocent? If so, how could anyone be safe? The logic had finally folded in on itself. The mirror flickered. I saw Cotton Mather again, the great Puritan firebrand. But his voice was weaker now, threaded with doubt. Even he began to insist, quietly, cautiously, that spectral evidence might not be reliable, that perhaps God did not demand this much blood. It was not compassion that tempered him. It was calculation. The court's hunger had become unsustainable. The community, once galvanized by terror, was sagging under grief. Fear had burned too hot, too long. The vision shifted to the gallows, now empty. The scaffold creaked in the wind like a rib cage with no flesh. A cart stood unused, the rope swayed, but not with bodies. Executions had ceased. In October 1692, Governor William Phipps intervened, troubled by the mounting outcry and the embarrassment of a colony devouring itself. He dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer and forbade spectral evidence in trials. With that one stroke, the fever broke. Without visions and dreams, there was no proof. Without proof, there could be no hangings. The mirror showed me a cell. Inside, gaunt figures, accused witches, blinked into the torchlight as their shackles were struck loose. They were not acquitted, not really. The stigma clung to them like a second skin. But they were alive. Others were not so lucky. Husbands widowed, children orphaned, farms ruined. The dead could not be pardoned. Salem did not heal. It limped. I watched Judge Sewell again, this time years later. He stood in Boston's Old South Church, his voice breaking as he confessed his guilt publicly. He asked for God's pardon, admitting that he had condemned the innocent. Modern scholars call this the beginning of American legal skepticism, the seed of doubt in theocracy's soil. But in that moment, it was just a man begging forgiveness for ghosts he could not unhang. The mirror lingered on his tears. Then it went dark. I sat in my room, shaken. Salem's fire had collapsed, yes, but not because they had discovered truth, not because they had embraced compassion. It ended because the machine of fear consumed too much, too fast, until even its architects could no longer maintain the lie. It ended not with justice, but with exhaustion. The lesson etched itself into my bones. Hysteria does not die cleanly. It dies only when it eats everything it can reach. And even then, its ashes remain, waiting for the next wind. The mirror pulsed once, faintly, as if agreeing. The reckoning of Salem was finished. But the curse of the witch was far from over. I sat staring at it, waiting for the familiar shiver, the pulse, the smoke of centuries. For a while it reflected only me, pale, exhausted, hunched in my chair. Then, slowly, the surface rippled. Not with firelight or ropes this time, but with ink. Pages, plays, pamphlets, the afterlife of Salem. The vision showed me the 18th century first, the townsfolk of Massachusetts trying to scrub the memory away. Ministers muttered apologies, governors signed pardons, families begged restitution. The trials were officially declared a mistake, but the word was ash in the mouth. The dead remained dead. Yet forgetting proved impossible. The stain would not wash out. The witch trials became a scar in the American conscience, too deep to ignore, too useful to abandon. The mirror flashed forward. The 19th century. Writers began to exhume the ghosts. Hawthorne, descendant of Judge Hathorne, wrote of guilt carved into New England stone, of haunted bloodlines and secret sins. His House of the Seven Gables dripped with inherited shame, a fictional exorcism for real crimes. I could almost smell the ink as he wrote, trying to escape a legacy that clung like smoke to his family name. Salem, long buried, had become literature. The mirror turned its pages again, and I saw a stage. Mid-20th century, the height of America's paranoia. The House Un-American Activities Committee, hunting communists with the same fervor Salem once hunted witches. Careers destroyed, reputations burned, names forced out of trembling mouths. And there was Arthur Miller, pen in hand, writing The Crucible. In the play, Salem's voices screamed again, not as a history lesson but as a warning. Fear weaponized, rumor codified, justice corrupted. The audience understood. They saw McCarthy in the magistrates, their own neighbors in the accusers. The witch hunt had not ended in 1692. It had only changed its costume. The mirror's glass seemed to hum, reflecting not just history, but repetition. Modern America still chants the word, witch hunt. Politicians howl it when cornered, corporations cry it when accused, communities wield it against one another. The phrase no longer needs witches, or even women. It is shorthand for persecution, for fear disguised as justice. But the irony remains, every time we use it, we resurrect Salem. The mirror's last image chilled me. Not fire, not gallows, not judges. A classroom. Children reciting dates, names, events. Salem packaged neatly into lessons, flattened into timelines. I saw their eyes glaze as the teacher droned. They did not see the rope strain. They did not hear Giles Corey gasp. They did not smell the smoke. History had become curriculum, safe, sanitized. And yet, I realized, the ghosts still stirred. They are not buried in textbooks. They are in us, in every whisper of suspicion, in every trial by rumor, in every silence of neighbors who know better but say nothing. The mirror dimmed, my own face returned, and behind my eyes I carried Salem still. It sat black as slate, reflecting only my apartment. I thought perhaps the story was finished, that Salem was the final act. Then, one night, it flared again, not with gallows or sermons, but with diagrams, drawings of brains, spines, blood vessels, anatomical sketches, pages curling under candlelight. Knowledge, not scripture. The witch was about to be dissected. The first image was a field of rye, stalks bent low under a wet summer sky. The grain looked ordinary until the mirror zoomed closer. Black sclerotidae nestled among the kernels like burnt teeth. Claviceps purpurea, ergot. I saw women convulsing in a village hut, their limbs jerking, mouths foaming, visions spilling from their lips. Priests called it possession. We call it alkaloids. Ergotamine, ergometrine, lysergic acid. Hallucinations, seizures, gangrene. In the 17th century, they saw the devil. In the 20th, Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD from the same fungus. The curse was not supernatural, it was mycotoxin. The mirror shifted again. A young woman lay rigid on a cot, eyes rolling, her body seized by invisible storms. The magistrates cried witchcraft. Today, neurologists nod. Temporal lobe epilepsy. Electrical storms in gray matter producing hallucinations, voices, overwhelming déjà vu. I saw a Puritan girl flail in court, shrieking of claws raking her skin. In modern clinics, we call it psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, trauma and repression embodied as convulsions. The devil had no hand in it, only the brain betraying itself. Then the mirror brought me to a hospital ward, fluorescent lights buzzing. Doctors in gowns hovered over a teenager, her body twisting, her speech broken into tongues. Parents wept. 4 centuries ago, she would have been exorcised. Today, her diagnosis read, anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, an autoimmune attack on the brain, inflaming neurons, hijacking personality, steroids, plasmapheresis, immunotherapy, tools of modern medicine could call her back from the abyss. But in Salem, she would have been hanged. The mirror turned again. A woman, gaunt, hair covering her face, kept in a cell. She muttered to herself, sometimes screaming, sometimes laughing. The records called it madness. The crowd called it consorting with the devil. Psychiatry calls it schizophrenia, hallucinations, paranoia, voices that command. Terrifying, yes, but treatable with antipsychotics, therapy, support. Not a crime, not a sin, an illness. Even midwives' herbs, once demonized, find their place in science. Willowbark's bitter powder, salicin, gave us aspirin. Pennyroyal, though toxic, contains compounds that disrupt pregnancy. Nightshade alkaloids became the blueprint for modern anesthetics. What was branded sorcery was always chemistry. I pulled back from the mirror, shaken. The witches had never flown through the night. They had convulsed on the ground. They had not summoned storms. They had suffered seizures. They had not brewed curses. They had steeped medicine. The devil was not in their hands. He was in our ignorance. And yet, something in me hesitated. Science explains the fits, the visions, the fevers. It names molecules, maps synapses, writes prescriptions. But science cannot erase the memory of ropes creaking, stones crushing, flames climbing. Explanations do not resurrect. The truth may free the past from superstition, but it cannot free the victims from history. The mirror dimmed. I sat in the dark, pages of neurology texts spread before me like grim holy books. We had unmasked the witch. But what stared back was not a demon. It was us, blind and certain, calling ignorance by the name of evil. For once, the mirror greeted me not with screams but with a flicker, like the first reel of a film. A projector hummed in the glass. Frames stuttered, shadows danced across silver nitrate. The witch had survived her own pyre. And now, she wore grease paint. The vision opened on a stage in the 19th century. Pointy hats, broomsticks, green masks. Faust, Macbeth, traveling plays that painted witches as comic villains or diabolical hags. What had been terror was now theater. Children laughed where once children trembled. But the laughter was nervous. The scar of Salem remained, and the witch still carried her old power. She frightened because she remembered. The mirror lurched forward. I saw a black and white screen in 1939, The Wizard of Oz. Margaret Hamilton cackling, her skin emerald, her nose hooked, smoke curling as she screamed, "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too." A caricature, yes, but she lingered in the American psyche, burned in Technicolor. The witch was no longer neighbor. She was fantasy, safe, exaggerated, laughable. Yet beneath the laughter, the same silhouette remained, woman, powerful, dangerous. Then the glass shimmered again, and Hollywood grew darker. 1968, Rosemary's Baby. 1996, The Craft. 2010's American Horror Story, Coven. The witch had become something else, not hag, not clown, but archetype, female rage, female freedom, female otherness. The same qualities that once condemned midwives and healers to the stake now became allure, power, even justice. A woman who defied the rules was not burned. She was admired, desired. The mirror showed me bookstores now, shelves groaning with novels. Anne Rice's Lives of the Mayfair Witches, Deborah Harkness's A Discovery of Witches, pages that celebrated witches as protagonists, heroines, guardians of secret knowledge. And then screens again, Harry Potter, where witches and wizards were simply gifted, their power normalized. For a generation, witch was no longer accusation, it was aspiration. The pendulum had swung, but the glass refused to romanticize completely. It reminded me, even as witches grew glamorous, Salem's ghosts stirred beneath. I saw feminist protests in the 1970s, women chanting, "We are the daughters of the witches you could not burn." I saw 21st century TikTok witches trading spells and herbal lore in digital covens. Reclamation, reinvention. The word witch, once spat like poison, now spoken like a badge. Psychologists argue this rebirth is inevitable. Archetypes do not die, they evolve. The witch remains because she embodies the collision of fear and desire, order and chaos, oppression and resistance. She frightens. She fascinates. She is us and not us. The mirror's final flicker was a montage: stage lights, film reels, protest marches, spell jars glowing on suburban windowsills. Witches in all guises: hideous, beautiful, tragic, triumphant. And I realized, we did not kill the witch. We resurrected her over and over because we need her. Once to burn, now to believe. The mirror dimmed, but I knew it was not finished. One more chapter remained. Not Salem, not Hollywood, but the truth beneath them both. The witch was never supernatural. The witch was the mask we put on fear itself, and the mask still fits. Not black this time, not fever bright. It was calm, like water before a storm, reflecting nothing but silence. I sat before it, knowing the journey was almost done. "Show me," I whispered. And it did. First, it replayed everything. Quick, merciless flashes. King Lycaon's punishment in Greek myth. Priestesses in temples, hands deep in herbs and stars. Inquisitors sharpening words into weapons. Gallows Hill and Salem girls shrieking in fits. Hollywood reels flickering. Witches green-skinned and glamorous. The story I thought I'd been uncovering. The story of witches. But then the mirror grew brighter, and I saw something else. Not history, not myth. Me. I leaned in. My reflection stared back. Exhausted eyes, hollow cheeks. But behind my face, layered like smoke, were others. The healer bent over a fevered child. The old widow accused of storms. The Puritan girl convulsing on the floor. The actresses in pointy hats. The protesters in the streets. The witch was not a single face. She was a collage, 1,000 reflections overlapping until the glass itself trembled. And in the cracks between them, I saw what had always been there: fear. The truth came heavy. The witch had never been a monster. She had always been a mirror. Fear of famine became spells. Fear of disease became possession. Fear of women's knowledge became sorcery. Fear of dissent became heresy. Fear of desire became diabolical lust. Every rope tied at Salem, every flame lit in Europe, every Hollywood cackle, each was the same story told again and again. Our terror given a face so we could burn it. Science explains the convulsions: ergot, epilepsy, encephalitis. Sociology explains the panics: war, hunger, paranoia. But explanation does not absolve. The executions did not happen because people lacked knowledge. They happened because people chose fear over doubt. The witch was never proof of the devil. She was proof of us. The mirror flickered one last time, and for a heartbeat, it showed no faces at all, only darkness. Then, slowly, my own reflection reappeared, unaccompanied, unshadowed. And I realized what it was asking. What are my witches? Who do I burn in silence? What truths do I call curses just because I cannot understand them? The question was not comfortable, but it was honest. The mirror dimmed for the last time. My apartment returned, the hum of the refrigerator, the street light dripping through blinds. Just me, breathing, heart still unsteady. I pulled the sheet back over the frame, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I knew the glass didn't need to show me anymore. It had already done its work. The witch was unmasked, and the monster wore a human face, Mine, yours, ours. History calls them witches. Science calls them patients. Literature calls them symbols. Culture calls them icons. But the truth is simpler, darker, harder. They were people, and it was not their curse that destroyed them. It was ours.